Welcome to Matt's Automotive Channel. Today we're going to be installing on this GT500 the PowerStop Z23 Evolution Sport and Brake Rotor and Pad Kit from American Muscle. I'm going to go through the whole process, all the do's and don'ts. Even though brakes are relatively a simple thing, there's still a lot of places you can go wrong. So anyway, all that coming up next here on Matt's Automotive Channel. Here you can see me washing away some of the brake dust that accumulated on these wheels, and this is just from a couple trips to work and back, maybe 20-30 miles. You can see the amount of dust that just accumulates on there. It's very frustrating if you like to keep your wheels clean. So these new pads should help eliminate this issue, and I know they will. I've had these pads on some other Mustangs, and they do a very good job, and maybe just a quarter of the amount of dust as you see here. These are fairly sizable rotors. You can see that the front rotors here measure about 14 inches in diameter, and here are the rear measuring in at about 11.5 inches. All right, that's enough chit chat. Let's go ahead and get this thing up in the air and get to work. Alright, upon initial inspection here, you can see that these rotors, they've been around a while and they've worn quite a bit. There's a pretty good lip or ridge right here on the edges where the pad does not rub. And looks like there's still a fair amount of material left on the brake pad. However, we'll take them off and we'll compare them to the new and see actually how much was left. And it also looks like this is the original rotor, indicated by the fact that it's got these original keepers here that are used during the initial installation. So that's one way to tell whether you've maybe had them off at least, or an aftermarket one, is if these are missing, then you can be pretty confident that the brakes have been off before. So anyway, these look like the originals. All right, these keepers can be a little stubborn to get off. So if you take some pliers and grab onto one of these little tabs, you can pull it out far enough to get a blade behind it. And then just pry it off. You don't have to worry about saving these. It's only put on for initial installation at the factory. We won't be reusing it. So if we destroy it, that's perfectly fine. So I get it out there a little bit, and then just cut it. There we are. And then we can just pull that thing off. One of the first things I like to check before disassembling any of it is just make sure that the wheel turns. If it's all bound up and you have trouble rotating it, there's a good chance that one of the guide pins are stuck or rusted in place, and that would be something that you would need to address once you get the calipers off. So before you take anything apart, just kind of look around and inspect the area and check to see if there's any brake fluid or any evidence of leaking, and just check the condition of the hoses and that sort of thing. Just make sure that everything looks like it's in good working order. All right, these Brembo brakes are a little different than your conventional type brakes. There really is no separate caliper bracket and caliper that are put together. And I mentioned earlier that there are some guide pins. This is a little different. There is no guide pins that connect the two. So anyway, the way to get these off is to first take the pads out, and there's two pins that hold it in. There's a pin here and there's a pin here that hold this spring down and keep tension on the pads. So the way to do this is to just put something into the hole here and then just kind of tap the pin out. And you can see it come out over here on this side. There's a lot of friction on there, so just push in on the metal piece, and then you can easily slide this out. And of course take this out, and then of course the bottom pin should easily push out since there's no tension on it anymore. I guess I lied. It's just rusted in there a little bit. Now actually, the reason that was a little difficult, there's a little spring here on the end that gets compressed, and that's kind of what holds it in place. So the combination of that and then also the spring pushing out. So anyway, that's how you get that off. Now, once that spring is out of the way, these pads should just slide right out. Okay, maybe with a little more persuasion. Just work it back and forth, top to bottom, just kind of pry it until it gets loose. I think the problem is that ridge that's on the side there. It's a pretty good ridge. These rotors are worn quite a bit. Normally this would slide out fairly easy, so there we go. There we go. That one's out. And the other one should come out a lot easier because the rotor's a little free to move now. Let's pull that back, and then that one out. These front brakes are a 4-piston system here. And you can see that there's 2 on the inside here, and then 2 on the outside as well. To be honest, I'm not real accustomed to working on these high-performance Brembo brakes. I'm more accustomed to the conventional style with the caliper bracket and then the caliper that mounts on there. So there are no guide pins on this type of brake. I guess anytime that you have pistons on both sides of the pad, you're not going to have any guide pins. So that's not going to be an issue with this brake system. However, on the rear brakes, this is more of the conventional type system. So we do have the guide pins back here. So anyway, we'll address that when we get to that point. So anyway, let's continue with the front. All right, so on the back side of the rotor here, or the brake caliper, there's 2 15mm bolts. So I'll just break those loose here, the breaker bar. One on the bottom there, and then one up here on top. And then once those are loose, we can zip them off. The electric wrench. All right, and once you got the bolts out, you can go ahead and just slide the caliper off. And be sure that you don't just let it dangle, so hang it up from something to relieve all the strain on the brake line. Otherwise you could potentially damage the brake line. So I usually just tie it up to the spring, like so. And then we can just go ahead and pull the rotor right off. Now, as you can clearly see, I went ahead and put the caliper back onto the spindle there because we need to work on this a little bit. There's a couple things that we need to do. One of which is clean up each of these pistons here because we're going to retract them, and we don't want something dirty like this getting retracted back in behind the dust seal here. So a good idea to clean all those up first. And I'm using WD-40 and a rag and then just kind of wiping it around there. The other thing is, when we do retract those pistons, take note that there is 2 bleeder screws, one on each side, and we're going to crack these open just a bit when we do that. That way we're not pushing fluid back up into the system and potentially getting debris into the ABS system, which could be harmful. So when we retract these, we want it to come out of these bleeder screws here. So I'm using the can of WD-40 to kind of clean up these surfaces here. Supposedly the WD-40 won't damage the rubber or expand it or anything like that. So just that and a rag. Spray just a little bit of WD-40 on the rag, and this works pretty good for cleaning. It seems to just dissolve or melt that dirt and debris away, or that grease, and you can just see there's tons of it there. We definitely don't want that getting pushed back in behind that rubber seal. So anyway, I'm currently waiting on a piston retractor tool specifically for this type of configuration where you got pistons on both sides. It occurred to me that I've never worked on the Brembos before, and I typically end up using a set like this to retract the pistons. And we will use this set here on the rear, but this is what I'm accustomed to using. But as you can see, something like this it requires to go into the side here, and there isn't. So we have to go in basically from the end here and then push out 90 degrees on each side. So anyway, I'm currently waiting for that tool to come in, and as soon as that gets in, we'll go ahead and resume the brake work. Now, when you're doing a brake job, sometimes you can take these rotors and have them machined down. However, there is a minimum thickness that you cannot go below. Sometimes that minimum thickness is stamped on the inside here, sometimes on the outer portion here, and then a lot of times it's just stamped right into the side here, and this gets really dirty, rusty, and it can be very difficult to see. So sometimes you just have to clean up the edges here until it reveals itself. Let's see here. Boy, we're gonna just have to start cleaning this up. I don't see it, but it's gotta be stamped in here somewhere. Here we are. Here we are. I think I found it. Let's just spray it here and clean it up a little bit. I know I'm not reusing these rotors, so I don't care if I get some WD on them. Okay, here we are. And you can see here that this shows a minimum depth or minimum thickness here of 30 millimeters. So if it's worn down below that, or even if it's a little bit above that and you're going to have them turned, you got to look at the run out, and if it looks like you have to remove more material that's going to put you down below that 30 don't reuse them. The rotors really aren't that much more expensive, and I just prefer replacing them anyway. Remember, the thinner they are, the less heat capacity they have, so they're going to heat up quicker, they're more likely to warp. So I really feel that it's best just to put new ones on when it gets to this point anyway. Okay, so we'll go ahead and check the thickness of this rotor here. Now, when you do this, you don't want to use this dial type indicator here, because when you do and measure it, what you're doing really is measuring this ridge here, which has not worn out. So you need to get a micrometer like this so you can actually go below that ridge and measure the actual thickness where it's worn. So go down below, and then we'll measure it. Now this is in inches, so we're going to have to convert it to millimeters. So anyway, we'll take that reading and find out. Okay, it looks like we're measuring here at 1.211 inches, and if you convert that to millimeters, that's 30.76 millimeters. So we could only shave off less than 1 millimeter on this rotor, and then we'd be below our minimum thickness. So obviously these things are going to the garbage. All right, just for kicks, we'll compare the old pad with the new one and just see how much material is actually left on there. Obviously we don't need to do this, but I'm just curious. So we'll use the plunger portion of the dial indicator here, and that way we're just measuring from that backing plate to the edge of the friction material there. Okay, that old one measured 0.176 inches. All right, so let's go ahead and measure this new pad and see what thickness it is. And it looks like this one's going to be 0.0320. All right, the old pad was 0.176 inches and the new pad is 0.320 inches. So if we divide the old one by the new one, we get 55% left on that pad. That's surprising. I don't know if those are the original pads. If they are, it's pretty amazing that the actual rotor wore down as much as it did, just going through basically half of a pad. Okay, we're about ready now. I got the tool in to expand these pistons. And so what we're going to do here is use one of these two bleeder valves here. I'm just going to use the exterior one here. If we're actually bleeding the brakes, we'll be using both, but all we need to do is relieve pressure. And the whole objective here is when we expand the pistons, we don't want the brake fluid to go back up in and potentially contaminate the ABS unit or anything like that. So we want anything that comes out of this caliper to get pushed out through the valve, not back up into the system. So I've set up a little cup here, and then I have a tube that I've just kind of wrapped around the spring here. And I'm just going to put that right here on this little bleeder screw here. And the reason I have it going up is so if the fluid comes out, it's going to go up first, and it won't introduce any air into the system. As you notice, I went ahead and finished up cleaning up all the calipers. So I got all the dirt and debris off of those, so we don't have to worry about pushing any contaminants back into the piston. All right, so here we go, and here's the ratcheting tool. And I've expanded this out already, just so it's a little bit less than the gap in here between the pistons. So I'm just gonna put them in here, line them up a bit, and when to start the ratcheting, then you can feel it bind up here, and then it's in there nice and snug. So as we ratchet this, it'll go ahead and start expanding those pistons out. All right, so I think we can go ahead and start this process. I'm gonna take this off here, and this is an 11 mm. Put this back on, and that way we can just crack this loose a little bit. So I'll go ahead and crack her loose, and then we can just start ratcheting this, and then you can see the brake fluid coming up here, just like so. And yeah, that looks pretty bad. So I think when we're done with this job, we'll go ahead and bleed the brakes and get some new fluid in there. So this works very easy. And there we go, it's kind of maxed out. So I'll go ahead and close the valve, and then we're done. All right, now to remove the tool, this is a bidirectional ratchet, so all we need to do is toggle this to the other direction, and then just give it a few turns there, and then it'll just come right out. All right, now we can see with the tool out that those pistons are nice and flush up against the edge there, so that should leave us plenty of room to put in the new pads. All right, as you can see here, I went ahead and removed the caliper and then hung it back up from the spring. And so the next step here is we want to clean this hub off really well. So I'm going to get some brake clean and spray this off, and maybe get a brush and get all the debris off, because we definitely want our rotor to sit perfectly flat onto that mating surface. All right, now we can turn our attention to the rotor itself. These particular rotors, they are side specific. As you can see, it has a label on here. This one says front passenger side. And we also got the hub all cleaned up here and free of debris. These rotors, they are shipped with a coating of oil on them, so they don't rust during storage and transportation, that sort of thing. So it's real important to get all the oil off of these rotors before installing them. So we're going to hit it with a can of brake clean, make sure there's no oil on this. Okay, now once I put it on, just to keep it lined up and ease in the reinstallation of the caliper, I like to put on a couple lug nuts. That way it lines it up better, and also keep it from falling off on your foot later. All right, now we just need to torque these calipers down to 85 pound-feet. Okay. All right, now let's take a look at the brake pads. These particular pads come with some new hardware, so we've got some new springs and some new pins here. Also some lubricant that we're going to place on the back of these where the pistons make contact. That will help eliminate any kind of squeaking, that sort of thing. And we're also going to put it around the edges as well here, anywhere that it rubs on the caliper. So like right in here and here, any contact points, basically we're going to put a little bit of lubricant. Now the other thing to notice with these pads is you'll notice 2 of the pads have these wear indicators. So, and then of course 2 of them do not. Now the ones with the indicators, they're going to go in pairs with one that doesn't. So like those 2, and then one with an indicator and one without. And when we install these, the indicator, the pad that's got the indicator, will be on the outside of the caliper. I think the reason for that is just so you can visually inspect it. You know, if you take the wheel off and you want to take a look and see how much is left, I think that's why. It's obvious it's going to make noise on either side, but by having it on the outside, it's visible and it would be easy to tell when your brake pads are getting down near their minimum thickness. All right, now we can go ahead and apply some lubricant onto the pads. It does it'll have an illustration on the back of this little packet here showing you where to place the lubricant. And again, it's basically anywhere you can have metal to metal contact. So get a little bit out here, and you don't want to use a whole bunch. I mean, just enough to coat these contact points. If you get too much, you up the possibility of getting some of this lubricant on the pad, which you obviously definitely don't want to do. That'll definitely screw up the friction material. And we also want it on the very back of the pad where the piston makes contact, because that could be a point where you could have some noise being generated. So it doesn't need to be very thick, just very thin, but just enough to coat it. And then this one here, this is the one that's got the indicator on it, so we'll put that one towards the outside. Okay, so I got the lube on this exterior pad, the one with the indicator, which we're going to put on the outside. And so we should just be able to slide it in here. There we go. I think I'll lightly tap it. It's a tight fit since these are full thickness. There we go. All right, and then go ahead and lube up the interior one in the same fashion, and then insert that. Okay, got the interior one lubed up, and let's go ahead and slide that in now. There we go. All right, then now we can install the hardware. On these springs, where to put the lubricant, it's real obvious. If you kind of hold it up here, you can see that these pins, they're going to rub right in this area here. And of course, the spring actually makes contact with the pads right here and here. So we'll put on some lube right in those 2 spots, and of course, right down here on the bottom side. Okay, so I'm going to put the lube right here, and those little bubbled edges. And then on the other side where the pin rubs, right here and here. And I don't believe there's an up or down. I think this thing's perfectly symmetrical. And then, of course, we'll put a little bit of lube on the pin as well. All right, now we can go ahead and install this. Make sure that these little holes in the pad are lined up with the holes going through the caliper there. You can always stick something in here before, make sure that they line up fine. That's pretty good. This looks like it has to come out a little bit. Okay, about right there. All right, I guess before you try putting the spring in, is just put the pin through first, make sure everything lines up okay. If not, you can kind of pry this out a little bit, make sure everything lines up. Okay, I think that's pretty good right there. So, in fact, we can just push this one through and then install the spring. There we go. And then we can put the second one in. continue to tap them till they're flush over here on this side. And they should just barely be inset here on the outside. All right, then once you have it on, just make sure that it rotates fairly freely. So that's pretty good. All right, now we got the passenger side front done. So just basically repeat that process. It'll be identical for the other side. And so for the purpose of the video, we can go ahead and turn our attention here now to the rear brakes. Okay, so on the rear brakes, the very first thing you want to do is get inside the car and release the handbrake to relieve the tension on these calipers here. And then we're going to go ahead and take the caliper off with these two bolts here. On this car, it's a 13 mm. Okay, and so long as you have the handbrake released, this should just slide right off. And there we go. This one we don't really need to hang. We can kind of just set back here like so. And then we can go ahead and remove the old brake pads just so you come right out. Okay, and then we can remove the old hardware. It's these two guys. All right, now on the back side, we got two bolts that are 15 mm that hold the caliper bracket on. So we'll go ahead and break these loose with the breaker bar. Okay, and so they're broken loose, we can go ahead and zip it off with the electric wrench. Now we can just lift the rotor off. Sometimes these rotors will be rusted to the back here, and in that case you can just kind of hit it with a rubber mallet and kind of break it loose. Some rotors have little screw holes here, and you can just thread in a screw and it'll push against the that flange on the back side of this and then pull this out. So if you do have some holes there, it's probably the easiest way to go if it's rusted on. All right, and then like we did before, there is a amount of rust here. And so if you put the new rotor on, it may not fit perfectly flush. So let's get this cleaned up as good as we can, as much of that rust off. And you can use a wire glue like that, and even a Scotch-Brite, just to get the main stuff off so it feels nice and smooth when you put your finger over it. And while you have the caliper bracket off, it's a good idea to get all the debris off in these areas where the hardware sits. That way when you put it on, it'll sit nice and flat. Okay, while you have the caliper bracket off, just inspect these. Make sure that the guide pins here slide in and out smoothly. I feel a little bit of roughness there and then here. And then also inspect the boots. Of course, with this kit, we get new covers there and new hardware, so we don't really need to worry about that. So anyway, these just pull out. If you're lucky, I've seen them where they're rusting really bad. And since we're going to replace the boots, let's just pull these old ones off. And then we'll go ahead and clean the grease off of this and apply some new grease. All right, and up in here you could get a Q-tip or some kind of cotton swab and get all the old grease out of there. And we'll wipe all the old grease off of the pin here. And then we'll re-lube it using Caliper Grease. Make sure that you use Caliper Grease. This grease is designed to handle the heat that the brakes endure and won't turn to a gooey mess and run out. So I'll just put a thin coating there. And then we got the new boots. These are the same on both sides, so it doesn't matter. Just push it on until it snaps in place. And then the same thing here, just push this all the way in until it pops. and then make sure it spins and everything, nothing's bound, and make sure that the pin moves freely back and forth. All right, first of all, in order to retract these pistons, they need to be rotated, so we need a special tool for that fits into these notches here and then rotates. But one of the things I want to mention up front here is, see the orientation of those notches, that they're lined this way. When you're done screwing the thing back in, make sure they're lined that way. Reason being, there's a little nub here, so that needs to fit in here. That's what prevents this thing from turning. And the reason that this one's different is because it's actuated two different ways. It's got the hydraulic system going to it, but it also has a cable running to it for the handbrake. And so they don't want this to spin. So anyway, when it's all back together, make sure that it's oriented like that, so that little nub there will fit into one of those notches. All right, here's the brake kit that I'm using. This is Pittsburgh. I believe it's from Harbor Freight. It's actually a pretty good kit. It has a lot of different sizes in it, and this is what we're going to use to screw the caliper in. And I already know this is the size we'll need for this particular job, the size 6. And the way that this works is that, okay, first of all, there's two of these devices here that each one of these little discs will plug into. One of them is a left-hand thread, one is a right-hand thread, so you need to figure out which one for your particular application. But anyway, that just magnetically couples here, and then we'll be able to thread the thing on. There's also a backing plate right here that we need to slide over like so. And then we'll go ahead and spin this back in, and then I'll show you how we go ahead and retract the piston. All right, but before we do that even, I'm gonna go ahead and hit this with the Scotch-Brite and try to clean up this dirt here, because again, we don't want this debris here getting pushed back in behind the dust boot there. All right, as you may have already noticed, I already remounted the caliper bracket. You don't have to do this, but I find that it's much easier to retract the piston with this in place and bolted in. And also when you're bleeding the brake out, everything stays in one place and it just makes life easier. So anyway, I got this thing set up here. I got the right size disc. So basically just put it in here, line up the pins, and then once the pins are lined up, you can thread this thing back out till it's nice and snug. There, that's in there nice and solid. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and put these caliper bolts back in just loosely to hold it in place. That way it'll stay in place when I thread this, then we can hook up the hose to the bleeder valve. Okay, and just as we did on the front, we hooked up the hose, make it going up. That way no air will be introduced if anything does get sucked back in. Back here I didn't have the spring really to loop it over, so I just used a little clamp against the shock here. And so I'll go ahead and just crack this loose. And then we'll just start turning this, and this should run the piston back in. And we should see some brake fluid come up here. There it goes. All right, and you can see it spinning the piston and then twisting in at the same time here. And we're really pushing the fluid out. And you'll know when you're there, it'll bottom out and then it'll become very difficult to turn. In fact, it'll just stop turning. But again, when it stops, make sure that those little notches are lined up in this fashion. Okay, it's stopping there, so go ahead and close the bleeder valve here. All right. All right, and then to not create a mess, I find it easiest just to pinch this off here, then pull it off so it doesn't drip all over, and then just hold it up high and let it drain all the way down. All right, one quick note. Again, I want to emphasize the alignment of those little notches are very important. So anyway, you'll notice that these two dots here line up with this. So as long as when this is in here, you have this part oriented like this, 90 degrees to the caliper, you'll know that they're lined up properly. Wow, look at that. We definitely need to bleed the brakes. This fluid should be clear, so that's pretty nasty. The other good reason for cracking these bleeder valves and then when you retract the piston is that if you do end up pushing the fluid back up into the car, there's a very good chance that you're going to overfill the brake fluid reservoir. If anybody has added fluid as these brakes wear, you're definitely going to pump it up there and then make a huge mess. Okay, and again, make sure that you clean the disc before you put it on. Pull the oil off. And verify that you have the right disc going onto the right side. Here's the rear passenger. All right, then we can mount the caliper bracket again. All right, the torque spec for these rear caliper brackets is 79 pound-feet. Okay. All right, now let's put a little bit of lube on the hardware here. And remember with this, less is more. I mean, you just want very little on there, just enough to coat it. Because, you know, eventually, all this lube, it's going to attract dirt. And we don't want clumps of dirt everywhere, so just enough to coat it. All right, another reason you don't want a whole lot of grease on here is because you don't want any of it getting onto the rotor itself. So anyway, these just fit in here, tabs, and it should just kind of click in place. Like so. There's one on the bottom, and then one up here on top. That way. There we go, like so. All right, now on the caliper itself, on the piston, I'm just going to put a little bit here, and then also a little bit on the underside here, where the pads make contact. That will eliminate any kind of noise between these parts here. Again, any metal to metal part, you definitely want to have a little bit of lubrication there. And again, very thin layer there. Okay, now we can put our pads in. All right, the pads should pretty much just drop right in. One on each side. Okay. And then you might want just a little bit of lubricant here on these springs where those rub. So just put like a real thin layer of grease there. I got some here on my finger. Because again, that's a metal to metal contact. All right. Now we can go ahead and slide the caliper over the brakes. And another thing to be careful with is these slide pins, they have a little flat spot on them. Make sure that that flat spot coincides with the flat spot right here. The reason they have that is to prevent this pin from spinning. Let's see if I can get a better view of that. Not sure if you can quite see the flat spot there. But anyway, this needs to be rotated so it fits right into this little groove here. So I'm going to rotate that. It should slide in there. Same thing on the bottom. There we go. And the only thing kind of pushing this out are those springs. And then also kind of visually inspect in here. Make sure that the springs aren't cocked off to one side and they're both making contact. Okay, now I can put the caliper bolts in. And these don't get torqued down too much. The torque spec on these guys here is just 24 pound-feet. For the caliper bracket, it's 79. But the pins that slide there, they don't need that kind of torque on them. All right, and then we'll go ahead and torque these to 24 pound-feet. All right, and then we're done. All right, the only thing left to do at this point really is just to go to each of the wheels, visually inspect everything, make sure that your bleeder screws are all torqued down, that there's no leaks, verify that the discs are all on the proper wheels, just make sure everything's in good working order. Also make sure that you put the brake back on before you lower the vehicle so it doesn't roll away. And then once we get the vehicle down, we'll go ahead and inspect the level of the brake fluid in the reservoir. And then we'll have to go out and take it for the drive to do the break-in procedure. All right, now this next step's very important. I just did it, but you want to fire the engine up, and then remember the brakes aren't going to work right away because those pistons have to be expanded again. So anyway, you fire the engine up and then keep pumping the brakes until they no longer are soft, and then you know that the brakes are engaging with the rotors. And then go ahead and shut it off, and then check to make sure that you still have enough brake fluid in your reservoir. If not, you may need to add some. We still look really good here, and all that brake fluid that we took out was occupied by the additional thickness of the pads, so we didn't really lose any fluid here. Even though we took some fluid out, the reservoir is still about the same. So anyway, real important to do that. The next thing we need to do is take it out and break in the brakes. All right, so here's the procedure to break them in. Basically, you need to take it out, get it on a road where there's very little traffic. Otherwise, somebody's going to think you're driving like an idiot, and you may even end up with a ticket. So anyway, what you need to do is 5 aggressive deaccelerating from 40 down to 10 miles an hour. And then after that, 5 deaccelerations, 35 to 5 miles per hour. Once you do this, the brakes are going to be extremely hot. You'll probably even smell them. And so that's why you don't want to stop, because the calipers get so hot and the brake pads get so hot. If you were to come to a stop, the heat would radiate from those pads back into the rotor and could potentially damage or warp the rotor. So this is why they say here to drive slowly, cool down your brakes for 5 minutes. So make sure you're in an area where you don't have to come to a complete stop, or if you do, make sure that you stop and then roll a few feet and then stop and then roll a few feet. But don't let the pads sit one place on those rotors. All right, that's pretty much it for this video. 2 of the most overlooked things, I think, when people do brakes, or one is that break-in procedure, and the other is bleeding the brakes. I mean, you saw how nasty some of that fluid was. These definitely need to be bled, and so I'm going to save that for our next video. So anyway, if you like this type of content, please like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you'll be reminded of videos going forward. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.